asked the officer.
Let me let Ms. McGinn do her cross, and then I'll give you an opportunity to do that.
Okay.
Or you want to do it right now?
It's just two very brief questions. I just thought since
That's
you...
fine, Judge. Let him-
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Bregman.
So, the judge had just asked you whether or not officers are trained that they may use non-lethal force twice, for example.
Yes.
And these are all rapidly evolving situations, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you know in this instance that the taser shotgun was used twice?
I do now, yes.
And do you know that the dog was deployed twice?
I do now.
Okay. That's all I had.
All right, sir.
Thank you.
Ms. McGinn?
Thank you, Judge. Morning, Sergeant Fox.
Good morning, ma'am.
Sergeant Fox, have you heard the saying that there are no accidents, just poor planning?
I have.
And at SWAT, one of the reasons you practice so much and have so much training is to try to avoid any kind of accidents, isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And also to avoid danger both to your officers and to citizens of the community, too.
Yes, ma'am.
And you know your men on the SWAT team, do you not?
I do.
And you know the chain of command on the SWAT team.
I do.
One of the things that is important when the SWAT team deploys is to have a plan, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And in this situation, SWAT was never actually formally called out to the scene or activated to the scene, was it?
It was not.
You came because of what you were hearing over the radio.
Yes, ma'am.
And because you got there kind of late in the game, you were never able to put a full plan in place, isn't that right?
Just partial plans, but not anything full.
Right. And when you arrived and first spoke to Sergeant Carpenter, you found things were pretty confusing when you arrived there, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that you talked to Sergeant Carpenter about was who was there at the scene so you could figure out where everybody was, is that right?
I asked him if he kind of had like a rough layout of where individuals were positioned. Didn't get a whole lot of information.
Okay, let me find out what you did know. Did you know from either your radio transmissions or otherwise that there had been 2 open spaces officers that started this whole encounter?
I understood that
Okay.
open space was the initial caller, or initial officers.
Right, officers McDaniel, John McDaniel, and Officer Patrick Hernandez were the people that first had contact with Mr. Boyd. Is that your understanding?
It is now the names. Before I didn't know the names, ma'am.
All right, and they were still at the scene when you arrived about 2.5 hours into this event. Is that right, sir?
I believe they were.
They were actually deployed down here in the southwest part of the perimeter. Is that right?
At the time, I did not know where they were deployed.
Do you know that now?
I do now.
All right. That was one of the things you were trying to find out when you arrived. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And there were a number of field officers who had been there earlier in the day. Let me take all these up there and see if I can put all those fellas up. The fellow you spoke to was, oh, let me find him. Sergeant Carpenter, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And he was the field officer, is that right?
Yeah, he was the incident commander, the sergeant at the scene.
Same rank as you.
Yes, ma'am.
He's the fellow that you spoke to and asked him if he had charges, and I think his answer to you was charges of aggravated assault, and he said, yeah, there possibly were some, is what he told you at the time when you asked him about that. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And it wasn't that he didn't know whether there were not charges or not, because he'd been there the entire encounter, had he not?
I wasn't sure if he had been there the entire time, or...
It calls for speculation.
I'll allow the question to be asked and answered. Go ahead.
You can answer, Sergeant Fox.
Wasn't completely sure if he had been there the whole time, so I was trying to gather as much information from him, what he knew, where he got the information.
Okay. When you were talking on direct, you said that instead you got your information from Ken Ronzone, who you know hadn't been there before you got, not very long before you got there.
That's correct.
Because you trusted Ken Ronzone and had worked with him in other places, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You understand that it might not have been that Sergeant Carpenter didn't know whether or not there were aggravated assault charges, but he may not have thought that Mr. Boyd was not that great of a threat.
Objection calls for speculation.
Well, counsel, I think this was, the point was brought up on
Sure.
the cross, or the direct, so I'll allow you to ask the question.
Can you repeat, ma'am?
Sure, Sergeant Fox. There were two alternatives, either that Sergeant Carpenter didn't know what was going on, or Sergeant Carpenter had dealt with Mr. Boyd for an hour and a half and didn't think he was that much of a threat. Those are the two alternatives, is that right?
Possibly, or he just wasn't sure of or he hadn't gotten around to investigating those charges, but I was unsure what was going on.
Okay, what we know now is that Sergeant Carpenter had been there for an hour and a half and Ken Runzone had not been there for an hour and a half, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
The other folks who were out there was a CIT officer named Brock Nipreth. Did you know that there was a CIT officer named Brock Nipreth out there?
In passing on the scene, I had understood that at one point there was a CIT officer that was at the scene.
And in fact, there was a second CIT officer named Michael Monet at the scene as well. Were you aware of that when you arrived?
No, I wasn't aware there was two CIT officers.
And in fact, part of your plan that you wanted to put into effect was to get somebody out there who could negotiate with this fellow, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
You have people who are, it's not CIT, it's CNT, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Crisis Negotiation Trained Officers?
Crisis Negotiations Team.
Okay, and they have even more training than CIT officers.
Yes, they're a little bit more advanced training.
But without those officers there, you could have used CIT officers to try to communicate with Mr. Boyd, is that right, if you'd known they were there?
Yes, if CNT isn't at the scene, CIT would be the next best thing.
Okay, and also among the field officers who were there right before you arrived was APD Officer Wetterland, who actually had a beanbag shotgun. Were you aware of that when you arrived?
I was not.
And Officer Wetterland was sent by Officer Sandy and Weimerskirch to the perimeter when he arrived with a beanbag shotgun. Were you aware of
Objection.
that?
States that's not in evidence, Your Honor.
Rephrase your question.
Yes, sir. Were you aware that he was sent to the perimeter with his beanbag shotgun rather than asked to stay there with the team of Sandy, Weimerskirch, Ingram?
No, I was not aware.
All right. So you weren't aware there was already a beanbag shotgun on site?
No, I was not.
And then there was another officer named Justin Rogelio, who was also there at the scene, all of which were sent to the perimeter before you got there. Is that right?
I wouldn't have known at the time, but if you're saying that's what happened at this point.
Okay. You were not aware that Officer Wetterland with his beanbag shotgun was over here to the northwest?
I did not.
Okay. And were you told that there were also two state police officers that were there?
I was told that state police were on scene.
And were you aware that they were helping establish the perimeter as well?
I understood that the two state police officers were stationed to the west in a perimeter position.
Which would be here, let me find him, there's Bankston right there. I think this has already been admitted, let me see if I can find where on here. Here he is down here, actually to the west, exactly where you said. You were not there when the rope team or canine officers arrived at the beginning, were you?
That's correct, ma'am, I was not.
Those are the people that you saw up talking to Mr. Boyd at the time that you arrived, and that included rope officer Sandy. Is that right, sir?
I never saw them from my position, my vantage point. I just knew that they were positioned up there somewhere with Scott Weimerskirch based on radio traffic.
Okay. And you knew that a rope officer, I think we've got SWAT officer, but that's wrong, so let me fix that. That is a rope officer. Ingram was up there.
I'm sorry, ma'am, your
You
question?
were aware that rope officer Ingram was up there?
I am.
And then you said the person whose voice And I think in your statement that was taken at the time, you didn't know it was Weimerskirch, but you thought you recognized maybe his deep voice is what you recognized, right?
Yeah, at the time, I wasn't sure who exactly was up with the arrest team until I heard the voice, and Officer Weimerskirch has a distinct, deep voice, and I realized it was him up there, and then later with the radio traffic confirming where he was at.
And also Ken Ronzone was up there?
Ken Ronzone later, as I was trying to establish the perimeter, the inner perimeter, I understood Ken Ronzone to be to the north.
Okay, and Officer McFarland, that's one of your SWAT officers. Do you know how he happened to get out there before you did?
I do not.
And so the team that you kind of brought with you, and let me put you up there, Sergeant Fox, that arrived about the same time you did. That's you right there, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Was Dominic Perez was one of the people that came with you?
Yes, ma'am.
And SWAT Officer Sedler, was he there before you
He-
were there?
Yes, he was.
Okay, let me put him over here. Do you know how he got out there before you got there?
I understood he was possibly listening to the radio.
Okay, and just came, even though SWAT hadn't been activated.
Yes, ma'am.
And then you talked about Officer Ornelas that came with you. And then you talked about this fella, Jim Purdue. Is it James is his name?
Jim or James, yes,
All
ma'am.
right. And you said he had special skills. He actually was out there before you got out there too, wasn't he?
Yes, after the phone call, he actually arrived before I did.
Okay, and Officer Purdue is the SWAT sniper, isn't that right?
Yeah, his skills are high ground precision rifle.
Is that what lay people call a sniper?
Yeah, you could, it's basically the same thing.
Okay, and before you ever got there, James Purdue had gone to high ground with his high-powered rifle and was keeping an eye on what was going on here in this area with his high-powered rifle, is that right?
Yeah, James Purdue let me know that he was directly south of the containment team.
We have him right here?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and so his job was also lethal cover, was it not?
His is lethal cover, also to transmit any kind of intel, movement, call out different things, and he's there to provide cover for the arrest team.
All right, and one of his other skills is that he can sneak up and no one ever sees him coming, is that right?
Well, he can position himself, and yes, in a position where he can great distance, which is an advantage and can't be seen.
Right, and he wears this camouflage to help and aid in him being able to position himself where the person that he's watching doesn't even know that he's there, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you don't expect that Mr. Boyd ever knew that Jim Purdue was over here, given his skill set, do you?
I'm not sure if he knew he was there or not.
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
In any event, Jim Purdue at no time ever shot Mr. Boyd, did he, sir?
He did not.
There was not really anybody in charge out there at the time you arrived, was there?
I believe Sergeant Carpenter was in charge, but he was handling what appeared to me the inner perimeter, the outer perimeter, and then trying to handle all the logistics, which would have been quite a lot.
Yes, sir, and by the time you got there, he'd already been called away from this inner perimeter, and he was down here with you, was he not, sir?
Yeah, I met him out in the street in front of the address.
Right, and do you know who called him away and all the other field officers away from the inner perimeter and stopped them negotiating with Mr. Boyd?
I do not.
You weren't able to fully debrief him, but just were able to get sort of a general feeling for who was out there and what positions they were in, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you weren't ever able to debrief or talk to any of the CIT officers to find out what had worked and what had not worked with Mr. Boyd?
That is correct, ma'am.
You never found out that once these officers, the field officers, had warned Mr. Boyd not to cross a particular line or they would shoot him with a beanbag, that he never crossed that line? Did you find that out before you went up there?
I did not.
And before he was shot in the side and the back, you know that no officer ever warned him that they were about to shoot him with real guns if he did not get on the ground.
Because of my distance, I'm unaware, I could not hear what exactly verbal communication was going on between the small arrest team and the Mr. Boyd.
Okay, and do you know if at any time, any of these fellows that showed up with the road team, K-9, SWAT team, ever told Mr. Boyd that they were now pointing real guns at him rather than beanbag shotguns at him?
I don't recall if anybody told him that or not. I was never informed of that.
Okay. You were not aware of the plan that Officer Weimerskirch, Ingram, and Keith Sandy came up with, were you, sir, before
was
they
not.
implemented?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
Do you know who came up with that plan, whether it was Weimerskirch, Sandy, or Ingram?
I assumed it was Scott Weimerskirch, just based on radio transmissions.
Well, and you're assuming something, so do you know, sir, who came up with the plan?
I don't know for sure.
All right. Did you know before this shooting that you shouldn't use a taser shotgun with a canine dog?
I did not.
You were aware that canines were trained with shot collars?
I am aware that they have shot collars, yes.
Right, and when they get a shock, that's to tell them not to bite something, is that right?
You're kind of out of my area of expertise on shot collars and canine.
Okay.
I know they use them for different things, but as far as behaviors, I'm not real sure when they do use them and when they don't use them.
Were you aware before this shooting that if a canine sensed a shock from a taser that was not discharged, it would be signaling them not to bite or not to engage with the subject?
I was not.
Okay. You keep using the term arrest team today. They actually interviewed you March 17th at 12:06 in the morning. You never left the scene, I assume. They interviewed you right there the very next morning out there. Is that
Yes,
right,
ma'am.
Sergeant Fox? And at that time, in your 19-page interview, did you ever use the term arrest team ever in your 19-page interview?
I don't recall. I might have used entry team, but they
Can you
kind of
look
go
and see?
together for
Can you-
us.
See what you hear?
Any misstatement? Thank you. Can you highlight in red any point in there where you ever used the term arrest team in your statement that was taken the night of the event? Or that you realized this was an arrest team or that there was going to be an arrest?
No, ma'am, just quickly glancing over, I don't see anywhere where I call it arrest team, call it entry team a couple times, but
Sergeant.
yes, ma'am.
The one thing you were able to do, Sergeant Fox, and that you said in your statement that you were able to do, is that you had a pretty good perimeter established right before he was shot. Is that right?
I felt it was good enough at that point where I could maybe take some time and then activate the rest of the team. It wasn't perfect,
Right.
and there was concerns.
I guess
But-
there's no perfect perimeter, is there?
No, probably not, but there's always perimeters that are better than others.
Right.
And based on that terrain, I was definitely concerned on where people were at and where the holes were.
And because of the perimeter that you had, you felt he was contained in an area that if he did move or try to escape, we would have him contained. Is that right, sir?
I felt I had a good enough perimeter and inner perimeter to at least go on to the next job that I had was, and that was to call out the team. I wouldn't call it a perfect perimeter, and there was concerns the whole time that due to the terrain, the lighting conditions, that he would be able to slip out of that inner perimeter.
When you gave your statement that very night, you knew how important that statement was?
Yes, ma'am.
Didn't you, Sergeant Fox? And at that time, you were given a chance to describe the perimeter?
Yes, ma'am.
And at that time, sir, you said, page 7, Council, line 25, so we had a pretty good perimeter. Had a couple of state police officers that were down to the west, so he was contained in an area that if he did move or he did try to escape, we would have him contained. Isn't that what you said, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. One second.
Okay.
You talked a little bit about Officer Pettis' training. He had much more training and experience than a rookie officer, did he not, sir?
He did, ma'am.
And he was able to, all that training helped him perceive and respond faster than a rookie officer would.
Yes,
Didn't
ma'am.
it, sir? And in fact, also the aiming system that you said you use because it is quicker, is that right?
It allows us to, yes, pick up the front sight quicker.
Okay. When you train officers, you teach them that they don't get to shoot someone for past bad conduct. Isn't that right, sir?
That's correct, ma'am.
They have to be an immediate threat at the time you shoot in order for it to be a justifiable shooting, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were very honest with Mr. Bregman. You said if someone is standing here with 2 knives, you might have to use deadly force if they're advancing on you, is that right?
Advancing or any kind of movement that I feel is aggressive.
Right. If they are turning, does that affect your analysis of the deadly threat?
It depends. Are you turning towards a citizen? Are you turning towards another officer? A lot of that would vary.
Okay. Or if my back is to you, does that make a difference about whether I'm a threat to you?
Again, I don't know what are you looking at? Are you moving towards anybody? What are the officers' positions?
Yes, sir.
Civilian positions, if there are any, so
And
it depends.
if I'm obeying your order to lay down at the time that you shoot me, what does that tell you about whether I'm a threat?
If you're obeying commands,
Yes, sir.
then I wouldn't shoot you, no.
Okay. There was nothing that prevented the officers in this situation from redeploying the canine before they shot Mr. Boyd. Isn't that right, sir?
I'm not qualified to answer about canine deployment, I'm not sure.
Okay. You know, Mr. Bregman asked you about the canine was deployed twice. The second time the canine was deployed was after Mr. Boyd was shot. Isn't that right?
I would know, now I know.
All right. And nothing, there wasn't any rule or any training that would prevent the canine officer from having redeployed the dog before Mr. Boyd was shot. Isn't that right, sir?
Not that I know of, but then again, I don't have much knowledge on canine training or canine handling. I've never been a part of the team.
Okay. Thanks, Sergeant Fox.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Pass the witness, Sean.
Mr. Robles, do you have any redirects, sir? I do. Okay. To address some of the questions you were asked during your cross-examination, I'd like to have you recall some of the radio traffic that occurred between you and Officer Weimerskirch. Do you remember a radio transmission in which you told Officer Weimerskirch that it was imperative to take Mr. Boyd into custody before nightfall?
I do.
Why did you make that statement over the air?
Based on the concern of the terrain, once again, the citizen safety, making it very difficult once it does get dark to keep him in that inner perimeter.
How does darkness make the perimeters that were set in this case worse than if we had stayed in daylight?
The individual can conceal himself and slip out, or if he makes a mad dash, gets out of that inner perimeter, which we've had people do, in the darkness they could elude us and we may not find them.
Based on your training and experience, having spent decades on SWAT call-outs, how often do suspects who you believe are surrounded escape?
There have been a few.
Now, with regard to your interview and the use of the word entry team, when you use the word entry team in the interview you gave the night of the shooting, what did you mean by that term?
And I guess it's a tactical term. Entry team is a combination of an arrest team. It's an arrest team and an entry team. They're kind of synonymous. It's a team that is close and can take a subject into custody if need be.
So when you use the term entry team twice in your interview, you would agree with me that you also meant to say that those officers would be responsible for conducting the arrest.
Objection leading, Your Honor.
Rephrase your question, please.
When you use the term entry team twice in your interview, what did you mean by its use?
What I mean is an entry team is usually where my team leader is at. It is the team that is probably, in the majority of time, are going to place the subject under arrest.
Now, with regard to the number of deployments that Officer Weimerskirch undertook, you would agree with me that from your position, you could not see what Officer Weimerskirch was doing.
That's correct, based
Again,
on where I was at.
Your knowledge about what happened at the, during the shooting is from your review of the video.
Yes, review of the video and other interviews where I've been informed of what happened after the fact.
Now, so what you know about the number of deployments of the police service dog by Officer Weimerskirch before the shots were fired isn't based on what you saw. It's only based on what you've heard and what you've seen.
That's correct, sir.
And based on what you've seen and what you've heard, how many times did Officer Weimerskirch deploy his police service dog before shots were fired?
Based on what I saw, I didn't see him deploy it. Based on what I've heard twice.
May I take a moment to confer, Your Honor? No further questions, Your Honor.
May this witness be excused from the case, Mr. Robles?
Yes, he may.
State?
Yes, Your Honor.
I just have a moment, Your Honor.
Okay.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask that he just be on reserve, just in case we call him to discuss Mr. Sandy's training, if we believe.
All
it's
right, Sergeant Fox, you remain under subpoena. Please do not discuss the case with anyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Roman?
Your Honor, before we call our next witness, with court's permission, I'd like to read in a brief stipulation of the parties regarding an
Okay.
exhibit.
All right.
And the parties have all signed this and will be filing it with the court as well.
Okay.
This is a stipulation regarding Defendant Perez's Exhibit G, and it reads as follows. The parties stipulate the defendant's Exhibit G, a video simulation of the relevant scene, is a fair and accurate depiction of the terrain at the scene and the relative placement of the named individuals in the period just prior to the shooting. For the benefit of the court, this stipulation provides a brief background on the creation of the video recreation and its parameters. The video was created by Dennis O'Brien, a traffic accident reconstruction expert and forensic mapper. To create the video, Mr. O'Brien took 3D laser scan data that had been collected at the scene by the Albuquerque Police Department's Criminalistics Unit and incorporated the data into proprietary 3D animation software system. This 3D laser scan data depicted the terrain of the scene. Mr. O'Brien then superimposed the depicted individuals into their positions by using unique identifying landmarks from Officer Perez's helmet camera video, as well as using information based on a scene visit with Officer Perez and Officer Sandy, who specifically identified where they and Mr. Boyd had been standing. Measurements of distances and angles reflected in this video were performed using the 3D laser scan data. This video is intended to depict the terrain and the relative proximity of each of the named individuals to each other in a freeze frame in the moment just prior to the shooting. It provides the ability to view the stationary scene from multiple angles and perspectives as the camera moves around the scene. It is not intended to replicate the position or the stance of James Boyd at the time that any of the shots were fired.
So corporal accept the stipulation.
Thank you, Your Honor. And at this point, I would move to admit Exhibit G, which has been stipulated to.
All right, Judge, you will be admitted.
And at this point, I would like to play Exhibit G for the court.
Go ahead.
Now Officer Dominic Perez will call Sergeant Richard Ingram to the stand.
Okay. Raise your right hand for me, please. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated.
Good morning, Sergeant Ingram.
Good morning.
Will you please state your full name for the record?
Sergeant Richard Ingram.
Now, how are you currently employed, Sergeant Ingram?
I'm currently a full salary police officer with the Albuquerque Police Department
And when did you begin working in law enforcement?
in August of 2003.
And what agency did you start working for?
The Albuquerque Police Department.
What was the first position you held in the Albuquerque Police Department after graduating from the academy?
I was a field services officer working in the West Side Area Command.
And will you please briefly describe your primary duties and responsibilities as a field officer?
Field officer is responsible for everyday police functions, handling calls for service, responding to calls, making on-site activities, that sort of nature.
And how long did you work as a field officer for APD?
Approximately 7 years.
And during those 7 years, did you receive any training beyond that which you received in the academy?
I did.
Will you please explain the additional training you received?
During my course of tenure as a field service officer, I attended a lot of training, went to the crisis intervention training. I was trained in field officer training school. I went through basic SWAT operator school, There's a bunch.
Okay, and you mentioned that you'd received crisis intervention training, correct?
That's correct.
When did you receive CIT training?
That was in 2005.
And can you please explain briefly what CIT training is?
CIT training was a 40-hour course of instruction put on by the department that included a classroom and role play sessions. So it was a combination of going to class, going through lectures, and then going through role playing exercises with actors who portrayed signs and symptoms of related mental health illnesses, and then we would deal with them through those role playing exercises.
And at the time you attended CIT training, was it required?
It was not required, no.
Why did you choose to attend CIT training?
Just being proactive with my training in the department, wanting to be the best officer that I could, having all the tools available to me.
Now, have you received any training on less lethal munitions or less lethal tools within the department?
I have.
Please explain the training you've received on less lethal munitions.
Other than the host of those things in the academy, so I was trained with expandable baton, taser, OC spray. I also received training in beanbag, extended range, less lethal impact munitions, as well as the taser X-Rep, which is another extended range, less lethal munition.
And when you say Taser X-Rep, what is that?
It's a taser round shot from a shotgun platform that delivers a taser device at extended ranges.
Now, after working in field services for 7 years, what did you do?
I tested for a position within the Uniform Street Gang Unit, and I went to the Uniform Street Gang Unit for approximately 2.5 years.
And what is the Uniformed Street Gang Unit?
The Uniform Street Gang Unit was a unit within Special Investigations that worked specifically with the gang unit and gang suppression activities. We were a high visibility patrol function within the gang unit that went out and did gang interdiction, that type of activity.
Okay, and when you were in the gang unit, were you still considered a field officer?
No, it was within the Special Investigation Division.
Okay. Now, how long did you remain within working in the gang unit?
It was approximately 2.5 years.
And after leaving the gang unit, where were you assigned?
I tested for a position within the Special Investigation Division again, which was the Repeat Offender Project.
And can you briefly describe what the Repeat Offender Project is?
The Repeat Offender Project was a group of detectives or a unit of detectives who specifically worked with repeat offenders, identifying repeat offender criminals, and then locating them and safely apprehending by fleeing criminals.
And how long did you remain in the Repeat Offender Project?
I was there for approximately a year.
And you mentioned that you're currently a sergeant with APD.
That's correct.
Can you please briefly describe the process by which you became a sergeant within APD?
The sergeant test within the police department is first a written test, a battery of questions. Once you take that battery of questions, your score is computed with the rest of the candidates that put in. Following that course of the test, you're assigned a position basically within an assessment center, which is again kind of a host of role-playing exercises, usually 3 to 5 exercises where people evaluate your performance in those role-playing exercises. Once that's done, then your total score is computed and you're either placed on a list or not placed on a list.
And were you placed on that list?
I was.
And were you eventually selected to be a sergeant?
I was. I was promoted July 18th of 2015.
And as a sergeant within APD, what are your duties and responsibilities?
I'm back signed to the Field Services Bureau. I oversee a squad of officers in the Southwest Area Command or Southeast Area Command, and we basic police functions every day, calls for service, on-site activities, everything to that nature.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention to the incident we're here about today, the March 16th, 2014 officer-involved shooting at James Boyd. Now, on March 16th, 2014, what was your assignment within APD?
I was assigned to the Repeat Offender Project as a detective.
And that's the project you previously talked about?
That's correct.
Now, how did you first come to know that an incident was taking place in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains?
I received a telephone call.
And who was that call from?
Detective Sandy.
And what did you learn during that call?
Detective Sandy explained to me rather briefly that he was responding to a call out from radio dispatch in which they requested the use of a taser shotgun.
And is that the ex-rep?
That's correct.
We've been okay. Now, were you on duty when you spoke to Detective Sandy?
No, I was not.
Why were you not on duty?
Sunday was our regular day off.
So if you weren't on duty, where were you when you spoke to Detective Sandy?
I was at soccer practice with my daughter.
And after you spoke to Detective Sandy, what did you do?
I also have a Taser X-Rep device in my truck at that time. And because he was en route, I went home and I changed clothes, and which is common with the response to that I was also going to take I was going to respond to the call as well to take my Taser device as well.
Now, you mentioned that you went home and changed clothes. Why did you go home to change clothes?
I was in physical training clothes from soccer practice, and so I went and changed clothes into something more appropriate for a call out.
Okay, and when you say more appropriate, what do you mean?
Jeans, t-shirt, and that type of thing.
Okay. Now, before moving on, I'd like to talk to you about some specifics about the Taser shotgun that you had on March 16, 2014. Now, will you please begin by explaining specifically what this Taser shotgun is?
Taser shotgun, again, is an extended range, less lethal munition. It deploys a encapsulated device, if you will, that is charged with 50,000 volts. The exposure time of that device is approximately 20 seconds. The X-Rep design is in a couple parts. It has a head unit, which has barbs to attach itself to a body's person. It has a wire which is energized, which detaches from the head and extends further down. And then it has a cactus probe-like apparatus or chassis towards the bottom of that. So it creates contact within 3 different points.
And if you can you please explain how a Taser shotgun is different than a handheld Taser that you commonly see on field officers?
Okay, so the Taser that we commonly see on most officers these days would be something that is, it fires the darts and wires only, and that distance is only good up to approximately 25 feet. The distance for the X-Rep or the extended range electronic device is going to be up to about 100 feet.
Okay. Now, why were you specifically in possession of that Taser shotgun on March 16th?
We were assigned them from the Repeat Offender Project.
Okay. And you've briefly mentioned them, but what are the strengths of a Taser shotgun? What are the benefits of using a Taser shotgun?
The benefits of using a Taser device, the extended range Taser device, is that it delivers an incapacitating effect to that person that you're reaching out to or you're trying to gain control of. That incapacitative effect takes control of their body, interrupts their central nervous system, which means they can't move, means they can't proceed, they can't go anywhere. It immobilizes them. When effective, it can drop them to the ground. This particular Taser device has an exposure time of 20 seconds. That 20 seconds is designed to give officers the amount of time to safely close distance while he's still under the effects, the incapacitation effects of the Taser, to safely close distance that time and effect a safe custody procedure.
Now, in addition to the strengths you've described, are there any weaknesses? Does a Taser shotgun have any weaknesses?
Sure. We don't use them on frail people, somebody that's sick or elderly at that point. They also have a fall factor where if you use them in like a second-story balcony or something like that, somebody can't control their fall when they're underneath those effects, so you have to take those into account.
Now, on March 16, 2014, were you certified to use the Taser shotgun you had in your possession?
I was.
Will you briefly explain the process you undertook to become certified in that Taser shotgun?
That particular class was a class put on by advanced training at the academy. It included, again, classroom instruction and a qualification where we went to the range and shot what they have with training rounds from Taser at the time. We shot training rounds at a target, and then that was the qualification for the use of the Taser X-Rep system.
Okay, and when did you qualify with that, if you can recall?
April of 2011.
Okay, and at that time, were you provided with any taser rounds or a taser shotgun?
Following that course, we were issued new shotgun taser, which was dedicated to that platform, and the taser rounds.
And did you ever come to learn how long those taser rounds were good for?
Through the taser training, I understood it was approximately 3 years,
So from the time you received them, how long were they good for?
from 2011 to 2014.
And do you remember the specific months?
I don't.
Okay. Now, after you went home to change, did you respond to the actual incident?
I did.
And what specific location or address did you respond to?
I believe it was 812 Piedra Vista.
Vista located within the city of Albuquerque.
It's in the far northeast heights. It's off Tramway and Copper approximately.
Now, when you arrived at 8112 Piedra Vista, what did you see? What did the scene look like?
Initially, I was outside the house, and there was a couple vehicles outside the house of 812 Piedra Vista.
And after arriving, what did you do?
I began to assemble my gear, putting my gear on. So I started going through that process, is checking all my gear, getting all that stuff ready to go.
Okay, and when you say you assembled your gear, what do you mean?
I put on my soft body armor, put on, in the Repeat Offender project, we had hard body armor, which was good for rifle rounds, so it was augmented body armor, so I put that on. I changed my glasses, because I noticed the time of day, so I changed the glasses from my sunglasses to clear lenses to have eye protection. Got my department rifle, ensured that I had my department rifle, my taser shotgun, and made sure my body armor had the recording devices on it.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that you changed your glasses from sunglasses to clear glasses, correct?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
At the time of day, which was late in the afternoon, the shadows were starting to fall pretty far as the sun was beginning to set, so I knew if I was out there for an extended period of time that I didn't want to have to mess with sunglasses later.
Okay. You also mentioned that you had recording devices on, correct?
That's correct.
What recording devices did you have on your person at the time of the March 16th incident?
I had a Scorpion lapel camera, and I had a digital recorder as well.
Why did you have both of those recording devices on your person?
Through experience, I knew that the Scorpion camera had issues with the battery lasting for a certain amount of time and other problems that we had with the Scorpion camera. So I was taking 2 different devices to ensure that the whole incident would be recorded.
Okay. And did you turn, as far as you know, did you turn both devices on?
Yes.
Now, jumping ahead, following the March 16th incident, were both your lapel camera and your digital recorder collected by criminalistics?
They were.
Both of them were collected?
At the time, I believe I turned in my digital recorder,
Uh-huh.
and I think the lapel camera was turned in later, but I don't know to who.
Okay, do you know where were you when your digital recorder was collected?
My digital recorder was collected at the crime scene van.
Okay. And do you know why that individual did not collect your lapel camera?
I immediately disclosed to criminalistics as well as my chain of command that I didn't believe my camera ever functioned. I didn't think it ever recorded anything.
So they didn't collect it after you told them that?
That's correct.
Now, you also mentioned, though, that there was a time when your lapel camera was collected.
That's correct.
When did that occur?
I don't remember the exact day.
Do you remember approximately when?
I think it was during that next week. I hadn't returned to service due to the circumstances. We weren't going back to work at any point in time. During that week, we were back to work, but when we weren't actually out functioning looking for criminals at that time, we were busy doing admin stuff, and it was collected sometime during that time.
And from the time of the incident until it was collected, did you record anything with it?
From the time of the incident to the time it's collected, no.
Did you reformat it?
I did not reformat the camera. I would have had the camera reformatted prior to this incident, which was common with that particular camera system, is that we would, if we recorded an incident, we would often transfer that to a hard CD disk, and then we would tag that hard CD disk into evidence for evidence. But the SD card was often reformatted following incidents to ensure that the memory card was as much capacity as possible, so there wasn't a conflict of having a short memory card or not having enough memory space to collect evidence.
And in this case, did you undergo that reformatting process?
Prior to this incident, but not after.
And did you delete anything from your lapel camera after this incident?
No, I didn't.
Have you had an opportunity to listen to your digital recording device that you had on your person at the time of the incident?
I have.
And did that capture the entire incident?
Yes, it did.
And what does a digital recorder do? How is it different than a lapel camera?
It's just audio.
Okay. So the digital recorder you had captured everything that was said during this incident, correct?
That's correct.
Now, after you assembled and put on your gear, what did you do?
I was met by a female resident out front of 812 Piedra Vista. She directed me to go through her yard and out into the open space area to the east.
Okay, and as you walked through her yard, what were you armed with?
So I had my taser shotgun, my department rifle, and my sidearm.
When you say a department rifle, what kind of rifle was that?
It was a AR-15 platform, which was issued through the Special Investigation Division.
And at the time of the incident, on March 16th, were you certified to use that AR-15 or department-issued rifle?
I was.
Why did you choose to take that rifle with you when you approached the incident?
Again, not knowing all the circumstances and points where I could possibly be used at, it was common for us to carry our rifle and a less lethal option to ensure that we had everything available if we needed it.
Now, was the taser shotgun you took with you the same as the taser shotgun we've discussed?
Yes, it is.
Why did you take that taser shotgun with you when you approached the actual incident in this case?
Again, we were requested for the taser shotgun, and then not knowing difference of circumstances of where we might be positioned, and in that particular incident, there might be a case where we have different officers or different elements, if you will, positioned in different locations, and having that option might have been something that we would need.
Now, how did you carry both your rifle and your taser shotgun?
They were both on slings at that time.
Okay. So you had them both slung, or were you carrying one of them?
I believe at that time I had them both slung.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that you walked through the side yard of 8112 Piedra Vista to the foothills, correct?
That's correct.
Now, how were you able to access the foothills from the side yard of 8112 Piedra Vista?
The 812 Piedra Vista had a gate in the back that led directly out to the open space area.
And did you walk through that gate?
I did.
And what did you see when you went through the gate?
My first encounter was Detective Sandy towards the first part of the trailhead, and then further up the hill, I could see that there was a male subject on a large outcropping on the rock, which was significantly higher than we were, and several officers standing to his south. And they were up on the hill, quite a distance away.
Okay. And can you please, we're going to walk through what you've just said, but can you please describe the terrain that existed behind 8112 Piedra Vista?
Open space area, which was very, very rocky, lots of cactus. It was very, other than the trail, it was very uncultured, if you will, very, very rude, lots of rocks, lots of cactus.
Now, throughout this incident, did the nature of that terrain cause you any problems?
Yes, it did.
What problems did the terrain cause for you?
Just maneuvering through the terrain, trying to keep steady footing, things like that made it, we had to take methodical steps in order to move somewhere.
Now, why is it important, you mentioned stable footing, I think, why is it important to have stable footing in an incident like this?
Just trying to maintain a presence of any action that you might have to take. So trying to keep a steady footing is imperative.
Now, you also mentioned when you walked through the gate, you were able to see Mr. Boyd, correct?
That's correct.
And can you describe his location?
He was significantly higher than us, and he was probably 50 yards to our east from the trailhead, and he was significantly higher, meaning he was probably 25 to 30 feet above where we were. A large outcropping of rocks, which had a very significant value to me because the large outcropping of the rocks presented another elevated position that gave him cover that made me nervous from that position.
Okay. And you mentioned that he was at a higher elevation. Did that elevation change cause you any concern?
It did.
What concern did that elevation change cause you?
Having that elevation presented a significant hazard to us because as we knew he was up there, none of his camp had been checked or anything else has been checked. We didn't know what extent he could be armed. And at his specific location with that elevated position and the amount of rock croppings he had, it presented a very unsafe condition for us.
And I think you mentioned you said that he had cover behind that outcropping, correct?
That's correct.
What do you mean when you say cover? Based on your training and experience, what is your understanding of what cover is?
Sure. Through my training experience, cover is something that's going to be able to stop bullets, if you will, to make it as simple as possible. Cover is going to be able to stop something like that. Concealment is like an area which it just conceals your movement or conceals your person, but it doesn't do anything to provide a stop for any type of threat like that.
Okay. Now, were you able to specifically see Mr. Boyd, any details about him from your position when you walked through the gate?
Other than him being higher, it looked like he was wearing like a black and gray long shirt. He had sunglasses on at that time, but nothing, I couldn't tell much more from there.
And were you able to make any observations regarding Mr. Boyd's demeanor at that time?
The officers were standing at a distance, so I was able to put together that there was something transpiring, but they didn't want to encroach his space, and that he was, I could hear him yelling at times, but I couldn't make out what he was saying.
So you could hear him, but you couldn't specifically tell what he was saying?
Right.
And that was from your position walking through the gate?
That's correct.
Now, after you walked through the gate, you mentioned that you saw other officers near a trailhead, correct?
That's correct.
Who did you see near the trailhead?
Initially, it was Detective Sandy. There was Officer McFarland and Officer Ronzone.
Okay, after seeing those officers near the trailhead, what did you do?
I walked up behind Detective Sandy and was just surveying what conditions were.
Okay, and when you say you were surveying the conditions, what do you mean?
Just the overall layout of what was going on and the area.
Okay, and from that position at the trailhead, were you still able to see Mr. Boyd?
I was.
Were you able to see him better than you could from your position at the gate?
Slightly better, yes.
And were you also able to observe his demeanor?
Same demeanor. He was still yelling. I couldn't make out specifically what he was saying, but he would often be boisterous, and the officers were still at a distance from him at that point.
And as you surveyed what was taking place, did you see anything that caused you concern?
He was pacing back and forth up there, and the officers were, in my assessment, were too close to Mr. Boyd.
Okay, now while this incident was transpiring, did you have your radio on?
I did.
And where was your radio located?
It was attached to my body armor.
Okay, and were you listening to it?
Yes.
Why were you listening to it?
The communication about what was going on, what was transpiring. So I was aware of what was going on.
Okay, and I'm going to play you a brief clip of that radio traffic. It's been previously admitted as Defendant Perez's Exhibit C2, which is the actual radio tape. and Defendant's Exhibit D3, which is the recording of the 911 call. I will be playing a portion from Exhibit D3, that's page 27, line 45, to page 27, line 25.
Before you do that, counsel, could I ask you to approach, please?
Now, Sergeant Ingram, while you were at the scene of this incident, did you see Mr. Boyd in possession of any knives?
During my entire scene or at that point?
During your time, yeah, during this time you were at the incident, did you see Mr. Boyd with knives?
I did, yes.
Approximately how many times did you see Mr. Boyd holding the knives?
I try to remember exactly. There were numerous times, but I don't have an exact number.
Okay. Now, will you please describe the appearance of the knives that you saw Mr. Boyd holding?
They appeared to be folding knives that he kept in his front pockets.
And did you see him take those knives out of his front pocket?
I did.
And can you please explain how Mr. Boyd would take the knives out of his front pockets?
When I was watching Mr. Boyd, when we had moved up to a position, Mr. Boyd would draw those knives from his front pockets in a very, I would watch the motion that he would draw those knives out, and it was a very methodical motion, like it was a rehearsed practice. When he drew the knives out, he was very efficient with that draw from his pockets.
Now, when you say you thought it seemed rehearsed, why do you describe it as being rehearsed?
My very first understanding of him drawing those knives made it appear to me that he had practiced that particular fashion.
Object to speculation, Your Honor.
I'm going to sustain the objection, counsel.
Now, you also mentioned that it was a methodical movement. What do you mean by methodical?
That it was rehearsed.
Now, how long did you remain at the trailhead with, I think you said, Officer Ronzone, Detective Sandy, and Officer McFarland?
It was only several minutes.
Okay, and when you moved from that trailhead, where did you go?
We moved to a secondary rock position, which was about halfway between where Mr. Boyd was and the trailhead.
And when you say a rock position, what do you mean?
So it was another position, a cover, but it was approximately, I don't know, probably about 15 yards between the trail and into further east to the mountain.
Okay, and why did you choose to take that position of cover?
Initially, there was another officer stationed there, and we moved to that position, and then we were met with Officer Weimerskirch.
Okay, now, and when you saw, well, I guess can you please briefly describe Officer Weimer-Skirch's appearance when you saw him approach that second position of cover?
I believe he was wearing a green uniform, and he was with his police service dog.
Objection, relevance, and cumulative, Your Honor.
Well, as to what he was wearing, I'll sustain the objection.
Now, prior to the March 16, 2014 incident, had you worked alongside canines before?
I had.
Now, can you please briefly describe the experience you had working with canines?
I've been with them on numerous apprehensions in which the canine was used to apprehend somebody.
Okay, and when working alongside a canine unit, how does that impact your duties and responsibilities?
The canine unit is normally responsible for his dog and gives the overall direction of that particular unit, and the other officers assume other roles.
Okay, and what other roles do the other officers assume?
So we have a couple of responsibilities, other less lethal responsibilities, and then lethal coverage.
And what is lethal coverage?
Because the other responsibilities are less lethal, they are often covered by a lethal or firearms to ensure the safety of the group.
And after you arrived at that second position of cover, were you still holding your taser shotgun?
Yes, I was.
And in terms of lethal or less lethal, at that time, how did you view your role in this incident?
I was a less lethal role at that time.
Now, is it fair to say that both you and Officer Weimer-Skirch were less lethal?
That's correct.
And was anyone providing you with lethal coverage?
Yes, there was.
Who was that?
Detective Sandy?
Now, did you have an opportunity to observe what Detective Sandy was armed with?
I did.
And what was he armed with?
He also had his department-issued rifle.
And throughout this incident, when you first saw Detective Sandy, was he armed with anything other than his department-issued rifle?
Initially, he had his department-issued rifle and his taser shotgun.
And where did that second taser shotgun go?
I was carrying it as Detective Sandy was the primary lethal coverage person. I took the second shotgun to ensure he didn't have to carry that as well.
Okay, so after you took that second taser shotgun, you had two taser shotguns, correct?
That's correct.
And then your AR-15, correct?
That's correct.
Was it difficult for you to manage both taser shotguns and your department-issued rifle?
It was awkward and cumbersome, yes.
Now, why didn't you just simply set one of the extra taser shotguns down on the ground?
A couple reasons. I couldn't just set it down for safety reasons. We wouldn't want to do that because if we have to move positions, and that would leave that particular option open and inaccessible to other officers. And depending on our location and what we were moving, I may have to hand that off to somebody else or give it to somebody to go to a different location.
Now, was there any advantage based on your training and experience to having two taser shotguns?
Giving different angles of exposure to somebody depending on what his location was or something to that effect. Using two taser shotguns or having coverage from two separate locations could augment the ability to provide that coverage.
Now, after moving to that second position of cover, were you able to see Mr. Boyd better than before?
Yes, I was.
Can you please describe his appearance as you saw him from that second position?
At that point, he still had the black and gray shirt on. It appeared like he had a couple t-shirts on. At that point, it looked like he had was wearing like black pants, I believe, and was still wearing his sunglasses, and he had long hair.
Now, was there anything about Mr. Boyd's appearance that caused you concern?
He was still very animated.
Now, you mentioned that he had several shirts on.
That's correct.
Was there anything about him having several layers on that caused you concern?
Again, just that it was odd to me because it wasn't that cold at that time for the temperature that we were out there at that specific time.
Now, when you were at that second position, were you able to determine if Mr. Boyd still had his knives in his possession?
He still had them in his possession, yes.
Okay, and what was he doing with those knives?
It would depend on, at that time when he was pacing, it would depend on what the conversation was like.
Okay, so how would the conversation dictate what he did with those knives?
When approached about taking the knives off or to something to that extent, that if you put them down and wanted to come down the hill, he would often get very boisterous, very irate, agitated, and he would yell at us that we had no authority to take his knives. During that time, he would draw them out from his pockets and display them.
And did Mr. Boyd ever make any threats to you guys?
Numerous times.
What threats did he make?
Numerous times he said that he would kill us, that we weren't going to go home for our families tonight, that he hoped we were prepared to die. There was a numerous amount of threats directly at us and also the state police officer that was there.
And based on your training and experience, what concern did you have after you heard Mr. Boyd making those threats?
That he had the weapons and he's describing what his intent is.
Now, after being at that second position of cover, was there a time when you moved to a new position?
There was.
And where was that position located?
There was another small outcropping of rocks a little bit further down from where Boyd was at, and we moved into that position after some time, some dialogue. It was several minutes that before we moved there.
And you mentioned dialogue. Now, based on your CIT training, did you observe that dialogue having any effect on Mr. Boyd?
It didn't appear to be having any effects.
Was he de-escalating?
He was very volatile. He'd go from times where he was talking about Department of Defense stuff to exploding, saying that he was going to kill us. So it was very volatile, and that was troubling.
Now, why was that troubling for you?
Just because the unpredictability of Mr. Boyd. It was just, there was no set, clear de-escalation that I ever saw.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about the actual officer-involved shooting of Mr. Boyd. Now, prior to the time Mr. Boyd was shot, did you and the other officers develop any kind of plan to take him into custody?
Yes.
And at that time, stepping back, did you have an understanding of what charges you had against Mr. Boyd?
I did.
And what were those charges?
There were felony charges for aggravated assault on a peace officer.
Now, you mentioned a plan that was developed. Who developed that plan?
And with Officer Weimerskirch.
And as you understood it, what was the plan?
The plan I understood was that we were going to use the XREP and then reassess.
And Officer Weimer-Scourge told you that?
He said we'd use the XREP first, yes.
And what was your role, your understanding of your role in that plan you've described?
My role, as I understood it, was to deliver the XREP and try to gain compliance of Mr. Boyd.
Now, did there come a time when that plan was actually implemented?
Yes, there was.
When was it implemented?
Mr. Boyd at some point decided that he was going to make his way down the hill, and that's when that plan was initiated.
Why was it implemented or initiated, as you say, when Boyd was walking down the hill towards you?
Okay, so he was making a decision to move, and that decision was at a point where we knew that his decision to move was going to encroach our space.
And why did you not want Mr. Boyd encroaching your space?
He was still armed for knives.
Now, will you please describe the lighting conditions that existed at the time Mr. Boyd began moving towards you?
It was getting significantly dark. The shadows were falling really far across the rocks, so it was getting dark. The sun was already down, if not just almost down, so it was very dark.
And what concerns did that lack of light cause you?
Again, Mr. Boyd was in a...
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Cumulative.
I want him to answer this question, what concerns he had about it. Go ahead.
Can you answer, Sergeant Ingram?
The lighting conditions made it more difficult for us to operate in, and I knew that if Mr. Boyd was at some point further back in the rock, it was hard to gauge what he was doing. It was hard to observe everything that we could see.
Okay, now as Mr. Boyd began walking towards you and the other officers, what happened?
A noise flash diversionary device or flashbang was thrown.
And who threw that flashbang?
Detective Sandy.
And did you observe where that flashbang went?
It was a little in front of Mr. Boyd and to his right.
Now, during your career in law enforcement, have you ever deployed a flashbang?
I have,
How many times have you deployed flashbangs?
personally once.
And was that in training or in, a real-life situation?
Real life situation.
Now, have you been present when other officers have deployed flashbangs?
I have, yes.
And how many, roughly how many occasions?
Numerous times. I don't have a specific number, but numerous times.
And when you've been around flashbangs as they've been deployed, have you felt the effects of the flashbang?
I have.
Can you please describe the effect?
Projection cumulative drive.
Sustained.
Now, after the flashbang was deployed, were you able to see how Mr. Boyd reacted?
I was.
Based on Mr. Boyd's reaction and your experience with flashbangs, did you believe the flashbang had its desired effect on Mr. Boyd?
No, it did not.
Now, when Detective Sandy deployed the flashbang, what did you do?
Immediately proceeded to fire my ex-rep, or the taser rounds at Mr. Boyd to gain compliance.
Now, you say gain compliance. What was your intention in firing the taser shotgun at Mr. Boyd?
My intention of firing the taser shotgun at Mr. Boyd was to stop his movements, to incapacitate him, to facilitate that safe arrest of Mr. Boyd.
Okay, and how many times did you fire your taser shotgun at Mr. Boyd?
I fired 2 times.
How quickly did you fire those two rounds?
I tried to do it as simultaneously as possible so that they were as close as possible together.
Okay, now, where were you aiming your taser shotgun when you fired it at Mr. Boyd?
At his lower torso.
Why were you aiming at Mr. Boyd's lower torso?
He had put on a separate sweatshirt, and when he put on that separate sweatshirt, I knew that the added clothing that he had on his upper body was going to impact the effectiveness of the total round. So my intention of aiming at his lower torso or pelvic area was to gain compliance through that large muscle group of his hips and legs.
Now, you mentioned that you thought the additional clothing Mr. Boyd put on could impact the effectiveness of the total round.
That's correct.
Why did you choose to still fire your taser shotgun if you had question of whether or not it'd be effective?
With any less lethal option that we have, there's a degree that there's a possibility that it doesn't work. Knowing that effect that the taser round would have on Mr. Boyd when effective was a benefit to the officers to safely take him into custody. So knowing that in effect that I could still target a large muscle group and still affect that incapacitation of Mr. Boyd, I felt that it was the safest way to take him into custody.
Now, please describe how Mr. Boyd reacted after you fired your 2 taser shotgun rounds at him.
The taser shotgun rounds didn't appear to have any of the incapacitation effects related with the taser device. Mr. Boyd actually threw down the bags that he had, and it didn't appear to have any effect on him whatsoever.
And that's based on your training and experience?
That's correct.
Now, after the flashbang was deployed and you fired your 2 taser shotgun rounds at Mr. Boyd, what occurred?
In a rapidly evolving situation in which I had to move, Officer Weimerskirch was moving up the trail, as well as Detective Sandy, and we were kind of in an L-shaped area from where Mr. Boyd was at. So I had to go up the hill, and then I had to turn and come back online with them. So I was trying to negotiate that terrain.
And was there a time when you saw Officer Weimerskirch deploy his canine?
Yes.
And did you observe how Mr. Boyd reacted after that canine was deployed?
I can remember the dog getting to him, but I don't know specifically what the dog did when it got to him.
Okay. And after the dog got to Mr. Boyd, in your words, what occurred?
It appeared like the dog came off and came back to a certain extent. But again, I was moving and I was behind Officer Weimskirch and Detective Sandy as I'm trying to traverse going from the west to the east.
And as you're traversing from the west to the east, what's Mr. Boyd doing?
At that time, he's going to his waistband.
When you say he's going to his waistband, what do you mean?
So he has both hands and he's going towards his waistband and towards his waist.
Okay, and after he went towards his waist, what did he do?
He efficiently drew those knives again. So he drew the knives from his pockets.
And once he drew the knives, do you know how he held the knives?
They were kind of out towards his side.
Okay. Now, at the time Mr. Boyd drew his knives, where was Officer Weimskirch?
He was in front of Detective Sandy and in very close proximity to Mr. Boyd.
Okay, and you said he was in front of Detective Sandy, so Detective Sandy was behind him.
That's correct.
Now, based on your training and experience, what level of threat does a knife pose?
Through my training and experience, a knife would be a deadly threat within a certain distance.
Now, please explain how you felt when you saw Mr. Boyd draw his two knives.
So my feeling was, one, it looks like he's taking a step to his left or to the east, and it looks like he's trying to come around where Officer Weimskirch is. At that time, I can see that he has the knives out.
And what type of weapon were you holding when you saw Mr. Boyd with his knives out?
I still had my taser shotgun in my hand.
Now, you understand that there came a time when lethal force was used against Mr. Boyd, correct?
I did.
Now, based on your training and experience, if you would have had a lethal weapon instead of your taser shotgun, would you have fired it at Mr. Boyd?
Mr. Boyd was at a point where he was within the proximity of a deadly force encounter. He had the weapons out and displaying his intent, and so yes, I would have.
You would have used deadly force against Mr. Boyd?
Yes.
Objection, Your Honor, ultimate issue.
I'm sorry?
Move to strike. Objection, ultimate issue and move to strike.
That last part I'll sustain.
Now, based on your training and experience, why would you have shot Mr. Boyd when he pulled out the knives?
Objection, Your Honor. Again, I would object that with the ultimate issue.
Counsel, any response?
Your Honor, I think this is consistent with the guidelines the court has set forth. I'm asking him, based on his training and experience and the observations he made that day, how he would have reacted to quell the threat Mr. Boyd had posed.
Well, I'm going to sustain the objection. I think that he's already testified that in the position he was in, he would have fired. I think we are getting too close to the ultimate issue, which I ruled cannot be answered in this case. So the way the question was asked, I think that certainly opens it up to him testifying to that. So I'll sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, how long were you at the scene of this incident?
Total time, I don't know, after the shooting took place, because we were there for a couple hours,
Before the shooting.
was almost an hour and a half, I want to say.
And throughout your time at the incident, did you see Officer Dominic Perez?
Not until after the encounter.
So the first time you saw Officer Perez was after the encounter?
That's correct.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Counsel, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and break for the lunch hour. It's 11:45. I'd ask that you be back at 1:15 and we'll continue. Sergeant, I'd ask that you be back at 1:15. Please do not discuss the case with anyone. Right, we'll be in recess. Thank you.
All rise.